Welcome or welcome back to Trail and Ultra Running and Training. My name is Will France, and today we're going to talk about training your back. We're going to go into the next piece of our strength training series. I am a running coach and a strength coach, and the whole goal of this podcast is to help provide a little more information so that we can, you know, help you train a little better and get a little faster out on the trails. And if you appreciate it, then subscribe, share any of the stuff that seems to be relevant on whatever platform you may be watching this on, either live or the replays. Anyway, today let's talk about some back things, pull movements. So we've been doing these strength series, and so far we have talked about squat and push and hinge, and today let's talk about pull. Pull is often could be considered back training if we're going to be talking about muscles, and it would also be like bicep or whatever. You can also have a lower pull. That would be what we talked about in the hinge movements, like deadlifts and hip thrusts and that kind of stuff. So an upper pull is going to be all of this back stuff that pulls weight closer to your body. And much like in the push or press movements, your arm position is going to have a lot of say here. But first, why should we as runners care about back strength? Valid question. And to be very honest, you don't want, if you really only care about running, right? You don't need a big back. You don't need this big lat spread or wings or whatever you want to call it, but you do want a strong back. And those do not have to be the same thing. As I mentioned in the press or the push version or episode, strong and big are not always the same. Someone like Bruce Lee was very strong, but he was still a very small man. And you do not have to get big in order to be strong. Strength is valuable, even if we don't have a ton of muscle mass. So we're going to talk about strength here. Some of that can cross over into building muscle mass if that's what you want to do, but they are not necessarily the same thing. And we'll talk in a later strength episode about how to differentiate those two things and maybe train in a way that pushes one or the other. It is actually the opposite of a lot of runners tend to think. So first, we should care about back strength for one, the same reason I've said in the past, as you're more than just a runner. So if you want to be able to do things as you get older, then we are going to want to have strength really everywhere. And your back is a large portion of your body. And if we don't have strength in those movements, then we are going to really struggle to, pick stuff up off the ground, garden, pick up a big bag of dog food at Costco. Any of these things are things that are going to be difficult if you do not have good pulling grip, and back strength, right? We also can look at a kind of a mix between functional and aesthetic issues here. We can get really hunched forward if we don't have a strong back. If we end up stuck here, this is called kyphosis, and this rounding thing. And if your upper back, it's really kyphotic. A lot of people don't like the way that looks. And at some point it becomes detrimental. I don't want to be this posture hound because I don't think it matters as much as a lot of people seem to think it matters. There was a really good book just put out that I think it's called Slouch, that talks a lot about posture and how there's all this nonsense about posture and how we just overstress it and blah blah blah. And I think that's really valid. However, there's also a point of no return where you end up so kyphotic that when I was living in Korea, you'd see people who would be who had worked in the rice fields for 50 years, and they're in this constant bent over position, and they walked around town kind of in the shape of an upside down L. So you probably don't want to get there. I don't, at least. So having some back strength and fighting the kyphosis a little bit is a good thing. Further, if we're going to run, it does play a role in breathing. At some point, if we're so hunched over, then we are compacting the lungs a little bit. You do breathe in all directions, but at some point, if we're completely hunched, we're going to lose some of that breathing ability. And obviously, running is a very cardiovascular thing that requires a lot from your lungs. So we want to be able to breathe. So we should be able to stay somewhat upright, not like ramrod straight, shoulder blades down your back, just not hunched forward. And further, as trail runners, we often carry packs. And if we're going to go for these longer efforts and carry packs on our back, then our back should be strong enough to support that weight. So back training does matter. And finally, I forgot this one, but it also is important. If you plan to use poles, that is such a back dominant movement. You're here, it's this big pull down. It is a pull in of itself. You use your lats a lot, and you use a muscle called your teres major a lot in order to do this movement. So if you want to use poles and you want to use them well, and you don't want to get extra fatigued so that you're just carrying around a useless piece of metal and or partially plastic, then you should also have back training so that your pole work is actually effective rather than just being a waste of time. So back training. First, contrary to the other movements where you really can do them most body weight to some effectiveness, right? Like we can figure out how to bridge, we can figure out how to do a single leg squat, we can get increasing difficulties of push-ups in various positions. You will need some piece of equipment in order to do back movements because the whole thing is you are pulling stuff towards you. So if you don't have a thing to pull on, then you're really going to struggle to train pulling movements. That feels obvious, but but it doesn't need to be a lot. It can just be a set of bands and a door anchor and a handle. It can be a pull-up bar like you see behind me, my like dog's cooling vest resting on it. It can be anything that allows you to get this pulling motion. It doesn't have to be complicated equipment, but we will need something. Whereas pretty much everything else, all the other movements we will be able to do without extra equipment or external stuff, right? So you will need some support. Even if that's just a tree branch on which you want to do pull-ups and climb on, you will need something in order to support pulling movements. Now, when we look at the actual training of this, much like the push, your arm position really matters here. And but it's not so much the up and down, although that is a factor. It's going to be more like how far it is out from your side, like your elbow position as it wings out from your side and how that changes. So let's look at a couple things. First, we have vertical pull. And if you can get into this position, that's great. But much like we talked about overhead press stuff, a lot of people don't have the shoulder mobility, scapular mobility to press overhead. So if we can't get into a good overhead extension, then we probably shouldn't be pulling a ton of weight in that extension, right? If we can't get to here without really flaring our rib cage back in order to get there, then like if we can't get our arm up, back, and next to our ear, then we probably shouldn't be pulling a ton of weight in that position either. Thankfully, if you move your arm a couple inches forward, like 6, 12 inches, so that we're at a slight angle in front of you, then you pull down, we can get a lot of the same benefits. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be working towards this overhead extension. It just means that we should be responsible. And if you don't have access to a position, then we shouldn't be loading it heavy. We should be working to get access to that position and then loading it heavy once we get access to it. So if we just do a like single arm half kneeling pull down where you're kneeling on the ground, same knee down as your pulling arm is like 10 to 15 degrees in front of you, we can still get a lot of that vertical pull benefit without putting our low back at such a risk. Because this is the problem when we try to like pull without actually having that overhead extension from the vertical position, we are going to end up either like tweaking low back because we're going to end up in a lot of extension, or you're going to end up hurting your shoulder because you're dangling a lot of weight off an unstable either rotator cuff or scapular connection, kind of depending what your problem is. So if you don't have access to the range of motion, let's get access to it. But in the meantime, load in a slightly different plane so that we don't hurt that. So that's vertical pulling. Now we can think pull-ups, we can think lat pull-downs, we can do banded pull-ups. There's an assisted pull-up machine at some gyms. We can do single arm, like half kneeling pull-downs. Any of these are great options for this vertical pull movement. And they're going to tend to work your lats a lot. This like big wing on your back that comes around your entire like mid to low back and scoots around the side of your rib cage. There's also going to get a lot of work in something called like your teres major and your scapula and all of the things like move your shoulder blade and your arm around, right? So these are really beneficial movements that I try to include at least once a week for people. We can also have a horizontal pull. And this is where we get a little more finicky about elbow position. So a traditional like horizontal pull would be something like a row. This is any row that we've ever seen. It can either be like a seated cable row or a dumbbell row with your knee up on a bench. Any of these things, when we think about a row, we have arms out in front of us and we're pulling them back and we're getting a lot of activation through our back as we squeeze our shoulder blades kind of together. Now, depending where your elbow is, you're going to work different parts of your back. And you can kind of think of it as where your elbow is directing your training. So if your elbow is down by your side, you're going to get more muscles of your like mid and low back, like your lat. And if your elbow's up at like 45 degrees, you're going to get your like middle back called your rhomboids, like between your shoulder blades, all the way up to like elbow above your shoulder. You're going to get your traps, or these muscles that kind of work into your neck that are often like really overpronounced on wrestlers. Right. So depending where your elbow is, as we pull back and do rows, you're going to target different parts of your back. And what I see a lot of the time, I see a couple things when we look at rows. If we look at something like a dumbbell row or a seated close row, I see people not, well, I see both. I see people either trying to move too much weight that they have no business moving, but very often, more often, I see people not moving enough weight with the right muscles. They're almost like pulling up to their chest and shrugging with their neck instead of pulling down and back to their hip and actually using these big muscles of their back. Rows can be really heavy movements. And if you have some sort of external support, like a bench, or at the gym where I work, we have something called a hammer strength machine that's a row where your like chest is supported on the row. And if we have that, we're able to use a lot of weight, which means you can get your back really strong. And if you're able to do that, that is a great way to build a lot of back strength without necessarily adding a lot of back size, depending on your targets. Now, the other thing I see is targeting too much of this like elbows just off the side position and not enough of elbows out at like 30 to 45 degrees. When we talked about that like upper back kyphosis, this inability to move your shoulder blades always being apart and kind of rounded forward, training the muscles of your upper back, like your rhomboids that sit between your shoulder blades, is really helpful to improve that posture. It is really helpful for long-term strength, and it is really helpful to protect your low back, because if your upper back is not always hunched over, then we're not putting as much stress on the low back. So we want to train that upper back. Now, this can be kind of hard to do, very honestly, because it requires you pulling out with your elbows out. And if you don't have something that's really stable to do that, it can be difficult. Doing a dumbbell row with your elbow out is not going to do a lot for you because it's going to be so unstable that you're just kind of winging it through the air. So for these movements, we can either use something like a chest supported T-bar row. I don't have that at my gym, so that's not what I use. You can also support your chest on a bench laid at like 35 degrees and pull out with dumbbells so that you can squeeze your shoulder blades together. That is actually really well supported because your torso is stable. Then you can just focus on arm path and get that upper back. and you don't need a lot of equipment. You need an incline bench and a couple dumbbells. You can also do that with a barbell with a wide grip. If you have a cable machine, we can set it up with a bar rather than like one of these close grip things. You can set a longer bar, grab kind of out on the bar. If it's a traditional lat pull down bar, you might grab somewhere near the bend and pull back, trying to keep the bar like right around probably nipple height and squeeze together. And then we can also do something like a wide grip hammer strength or even an old school, it's called a Meadows row. I would look that up on YouTube. I have a video of one. The man who made up the thing, from what I understand, his name is John Meadows. He definitely has videos on them. Um, but they're super useful for your upper back as well. So any of these movements will train your back. You don't need to do a ton of them. They should probably be heavier than you think they should be, but we still also want to move through full range of motion, right? So like all of these warnings, caveats, notes aside, like don't be afraid to move heavy weight and get strong, but also make sure that you're using good form and actually hitting the muscles you want to use. You will often see somebody like draped over the dumbbell rack, kind of rowing something 3 inches at a time, just because it's always a guy, just because he wants to move heavy weight. But I also see so many people like shrugging this weight up to their chest as they move a 10-pound dumbbell. You can absolutely row more than a 10-pound dumbbell unless your arm is currently broken. I almost guarantee it. In fact, I do guarantee it. I don't know anybody who can row who doesn't need more weight than that. So don't be afraid to use these big muscles of your back, but also make sure that we're using good form. Now, let's look at some accessory stuff. Traps are your trapezius muscles, are these muscles that kind of connect your neck down to your shoulders. And you can think like standard triangle neck guy who probably wrestled or something. Um, these muscles are important. I have not intentionally trained them in a very long time. However, we should also understand the trapezius goes from your neck all the way down to like mid to low back. And it's a very long muscle with like sideways muscle fibers. And while I don't train this upper portion that connects to neck, I do accidentally train the middle of it when I hit upper back and rhomboids. And I train the bottom of it when we do something like dips, because these muscles, this muscle is technically the same muscle, but the fibers run laterally. So we can almost think about it working in three parts. And unless you want a really big neck for like if you wrestle, this is a really good idea because it's going to protect your neck. If you run, this is probably a waste of muscle mass, right? So we don't need a big overactive trap that's going to probably shrug into your pack and just make your neck really tight. Instead, we can train them accidentally by doing other things. Occasionally, we end up with a sore neck because the trap is too weak that it can't do its job. More often, people just try to overuse the thing and then shrug in because they have no ability to use the rest of their back. So this is where we get into like, what is your personal problem, ache, pain, etc. And I don't know, you're not going to find that answer on a podcast, but you can try and play with some things and see what they get, or you can shoot me a message. So when we look at some other accessory stuff aside from traps, we get biceps. Biceps are the very like clear accessory pull muscle. And I think, I mean, it was a big thing for a long time where biceps were kind of the thing. It was like biceps and bench press. Like when we ask someone to show a muscle, or if you like type muscle into your phone, the thing that comes up is this like bicep position, right? And they then fell out of favor partially with the role of like fun or rise of functional training in CrossFit. It's like shiny muscles that nobody ever needs to train. And wouldn't you know it, a bunch of people started tearing their biceps. So it really depends on your activity and like how much you're doing and how much weight you're trying to move and what you care about. To be fair, you don't need big, burly biceps because they are largely a shiny muscle. However, if you like to do things like climb or a friend does aerials, like any of this stuff where you're gripping a lot and holding a lot of your body weight through your arm, then we should probably occasionally do some bicep work, be that um, pull-ups that are really focused on the arms, or some curls, or just something. It doesn't need to be a lot. I rarely hit them, and I mostly hit them by doing other stuff, but occasionally I'll do a little bit of bicep stuff. And the reason is I climb rocks. And when I climb rocks and I don't ever hit biceps, I end up with elbow tendinopathy. So protect yourself, realize what you need. If your only sport is running and you don't really care about any of the pulling related sports, probably don't need super strong biceps. Maybe hit them occasionally, hit them up a couple times a year. But I also think that we got very much into this like functional space where biceps were just this like shiny muscle that only people care about who want to be like half naked on stage, which is also not true. They do serve a purpose. They're there for a reason. So, and then finally, all of this pull work you do requires a lot of gripping. So your forearms are going to get worked. If your grip is your limiting factor for a while, that's super normal. It really is. Like, it doesn't need to be this big thing. It will catch up. It might take a while, but it'll catch up. If you are doing something like a lat pull down, and it's just a quick tip, if you're doing something like a lat pull down or a pull up or a row, and you can't feel your back, and all you can feel is like these muscles in your forearm, then instead of gripping it, let me see what I have here. Instead of gripping it with a full grip where your thumb goes around the bar, if you have your thumb at what's called a false grip, up and in line with your fingers, then we will often get less out of our forearm because we aren't able to crush it as much. We're just going to be able to use it as a hook. A lot of the time with back training, we want to think of the hand and the entire lower arm as a hook. And then we're really driving with the elbow and able to be, in order to be able to use the back better. Now, you might struggle to feel your back completely. A lot of people do. This is one of the muscles that can take a long time to find muscle connection. And part of that's just because it's behind you. Like eventually it's pretty easy to find your chest because you can look at it and squeeze it and make it work. Whereas with the back, it's really hard to see and like hard to activate. And especially because we can't really necessarily find that connection all the time anyway, it can be really difficult to get that what we call mind muscle connection. Let's do some work, put in some things. We can do some prep things to like make it a little better. Um, but for the most part, if you're doing a lat pull down, your lats are working, or else your arm would fall off. Right? It doesn't necessarily mean they're working as well as you want them to, but it's this giant muscle in your back that comes around and attaches here into your humerus in your arm. If that weren't attached, your arm would just fall. Right. So we need to understand that like it, your lat does things, even if we don't necessarily have the best connection. So don't overthink it too much. That's a lot of the thing I try to teach people with training across the board. Don't overthink it too much, and you'll probably do a lot better. Anyway, I hope this was helpful. There's going to be a few more of these. I was going to do one more because I kind of think of things in like 5 movements where it's like squat, hinge, push, pull, and then core stuff. But I also realized I should probably talk about like power movements and explosivity, maybe some stability and mobility things, and then probably how to like build a program and put it into your year. So this is going to be an ongoing series for, I don't know, at least another month. So if you like it, let me know. If you have any questions, let me know. If you want any personal help on how to help make your strength programming more effective, shoot me a message. Either DM me on Instagram or go to my website, willfrance.com, and fill out an application form. There's also a link in the podcast notes. And I would love to talk with you because clearly, after rambling for 25 minutes on back things, I care about this stuff. So let me know. I'd love to chat with you. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Next week, we will talk about core stuff and low back things and your entire 360-degree midsection so we can perform better and run a little more. Anyway, hope you have a great day. Have some fun on the trails.